Welcome to Classical Education, a podcast for those who believe in rediscovering the art of asking questions, engaging in conversation, and attending to the ideas at the heart of well-ordered teaching and learning. I invite you to join me on a journey in pursuit of the true, the good, and the beautiful as a participant in the great conversation, and listen to the many voices coming from the world of classical education. This podcast is produced by Beautiful Teaching. We have a dozen master teachers who offer affordable online webinars and book studies. Our catalog for this winter and spring is finally up. There are some really exciting new courses this season. We invite you to look at our catalog, and you're sure to find something that's interesting to you. You can visit our registration page at beautifulteaching.coursestorm.com. Again, beautifulteaching.coursestorm.com. In addition, the Beautiful Teaching newsletters written by our team come out about once a quarter. The most recent newsletter is written by our history and school leadership expert, John Heitzenreiter. You can find our classical reading corner at beautifulteaching.com/newsletters, or just look for our resources tab to access our newsletters, and that's simply beautifulteaching.com. So that's again, beautifulteaching.coursestorm.com for our courses. Or our main website is beautifulteaching.com, and you can just look for the resources tab and scroll down and find our newsletters. So both of these links will be in the show notes of this episode. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show today. I am honored to have with me today Karen Glass and Dr. Robert Terry, and I invited them on today to discuss Charlotte Mason's connections to Coleridge, especially his work on method. And this is one of the first episodes I've ever recorded that I actually haven't read the material first. I have not read On Method by Coleridge, but I think the conversation is important enough that I needed to have them on to discuss it, because some recent misunderstandings of Charlotte Mason being attached to the Romantics needs addressed, and Coleridge is one Romantic that would be a very good Romantic to be connected to. So I would like to just introduce to you Robert Terry and Karen Glass, and we'll start with you, Robert. Why don't you give us an introduction to yourself and your connections with Charlotte Mason, as well as your understanding of Coleridge?
Thank you, Adrienne. Yeah, I've been part of the classical education movement for the last 25 years, including helping to start a classical school. And I've been in teacher training and curriculum development. And I came across Charlotte Mason very early on. I had in my library that set of those paperback books with the pink lettering on them. And I kind of dipped in and out of them for a few years, but didn't find anything to capture my imagination till I had been teaching for 3 or 4 years and my children were getting school age, that I actually sat down to read them and completely fell in love with the depth of knowledge and the practical connection of kind of a literary and liberal arts education that she had put together in that series.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and over the years, I know you're very well read, and a lot of times I actually ask you, Robert, what should I read? Because you and Karen are both way more well read than I am, and I consider both of you mentors to me. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about your experience with reading Coleridge? And let's start off with who he was.
Yeah, most of us are familiar with Coleridge as a romantic poet, and we probably know one or two of his most famous poems, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner or Kubla Khan. We may know about his opium addiction that he struggled with all of his life. But really, those two poems were written when he was in his young 20s. And he went on to do other things for the next 30 years, mainly in literary criticism, in philosophy, and in theology. He was a true genius, very famous for being a talker. And he coined over 100 new English words. So he used some of I'll give you a couple of examples: cosmological, cyclical, fatalistic, So you can just name dozens of words that he coined.
Oh, kind of
And
like
so,
Shakespeare. He's like a Shakespeare.
okay, yeah, and he's really probably the one who's responsible for bringing back Shakespeare to popularity. In the 100 years after Shakespeare, he kind of fell out of favor in literary circles, and Coleridge was instrumental in bringing him back
Interesting.
to popularity. He's also one of the great thinkers about the imagination. So we probably wouldn't have George MacDonald or C.S. Lewis or J.R.R. Tolkien if it wasn't for Coleridge's kind of being the foundation of English fantasy literature. And the element that makes him a romantic is really his rebellion against the Enlightenment thinking and reducing everything down to matter and motion, what he called being a literalist, because he said they thought everything was just made up of little particles. And he brought back the centrality of the imagination in thinking, in literature, and in education too.
Mm, mm. When you read on method, so we're going to get into this here, and I'm going to be able to bring Karen into this as well. What struck you first when you read on method?
Its incredible difficulty. He is not accessible. That's the thing. If somebody says, well, what should I read by Coleridge? It's hard to say because it is very difficult. So it's a kind of a slow read and slow mining type of thing. And the essay itself that he wrote on method was for the introduction to an encyclopedia. And so we can talk about why that matters later. Um, but one thing you notice if you've read, and I came to Coleridge after reading Mason, when you read this, you will see ideas jumping off the page that are directly used and referenced by Charlotte Mason. And so she obviously found it a very important work for her educational thinking.
Mm-hmm. So we'll bring Karen in here. Karen, I know you've written some blog posts about connections of Coleridge that you noticed in Charlotte Mason. Um, Tell our listeners kind of what struck you first when you read on Method with Coleridge by Coleridge.
Well, I picked up the book in the first place to read as part of my I want to read what Charlotte Mason read project. So um, I'll never get finished. Like, I'll never read everything that she read. But so there was the only reason I picked it up to read in the first place was because Charlotte Mason mentions it multiple times. And like Robert, this is not an easy book to read. It was very difficult. So um, I, I don't know that this would be a problem for everybody, but it's full of, among other things, Greek and Latin passages or words completely untranslated. So, um, in the Greek letters, even not even not even transliterated. So it was written in the era that it was written. The readers would have been able to just follow that, but it is difficult to follow his argument, his language. Um, And so I ended up reading the book 3 times because I could tell from the very beginning. One of the things in my copy, I think I got all the way to page 3, and I was completely captivated by his writing. We discovered that there's a science of method, he said, and that science, like all others, must necessarily have its principles. And then a little further down the page, as he's talking about method, he said, we may therefore assert that the relations of things form the prime objects, or so to speak, the materials of method. And it's just so similar to Charlotte Mason's idea of
I
education
hear
as a
that.
science of relations that I really wanted to understand it. So, I mean, that's why I read it. And as you read through it, every once in a while, as a Charlotte Mason scholar, as a Charlotte Mason reader, you'll bump into a paragraph, like a whole paragraph, and be like, oh, I get this bit because I've read it. She quotes extensively from many parts of this volume. But in addition, there are just ideas that she incorporated and folded into her own writing and thinking. By the time I was finished reading it and trying to understand what Coleridge had to say, I was convinced that this book was formative for Charlotte Mason's ideas about education.
Hmm. 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 Yeah, and I'm going to make sure to put a link to your blog posts in the show notes for anyone who wants to read.
Right, right. So my blog post, because I, like Robert, cannot suggest that anybody just run out and pick this book up to read it. I mean, if you don't, if you want to make that kind of an effort, you can. But I think that most readers would just not want to, at least in homeschooling mom circles,
Mhm.
as opposed to academic circles.
And busy
Um,
teachers.
Right, right. It's not long, but it's difficult. And so I wrote the blog post to try and hit as many highlights as I could, um, to walk through his essential arguments and just present them in a more comprehensible way
Mhm.
to the extent that I was able.
Well, and Robert, you brought up too this importance of encyclopedia. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it's interesting as we think of this encyclopedias, we use the encounter. They are arranged from A to Z by the first letter of each thing that's in the encyclopedia. And Coleridge, um, he did not like that at all because what does it do? It just shows you that there's kind of an equality between any fact that you can look up. Also, if you picked up volume one and read from the beginning to the end, you would gain a lot of knowledge, but it would be disconnected knowledge. There would be nothing to tie it together. And so, what he was working on was an idea called a methodological encyclopedia. And so, it was going to be arranged in such a way that you read from the beginning to end and it connected all of the material together in an overarching methodology. Let me give you an example just of a little bit, and I think it'll help make sense. So his encyclopedia would start with language. What are the basis of what is the basis of language, of grammar and logic, and then number? And then next, he would go to what he called the real things, metaphysics, morals, and theology. And so you're getting the overarching foundations. And then it would go through the various types of sciences, both applied sciences and experimental sciences. And then it would close out with the historical section, which would have biographies and histories and then other miscellaneous things. Then it would have an index, so you could look up all of those things like you would in a normal encyclopedia. But if you read it from beginning to end, not only would you have knowledge, but you would have hopefully gained wisdom and understanding because you could see how all of these individual things fit together as a whole. And that was kind of his view of what education should be like, right? These things are all related.
Yeah, okay, Robert. So the connection I'm making when you explain that is that clearly sounds very much like I'm hearing trivium, quadrivium, the seven liberal arts, and the unification of integrating everything. Being this is classical education. What you're saying, this this idea to me is very much a descriptor of what a liberal arts education is supposed to be and do.
Absolutely. That's what an encyclopedia is for, right? It's supposed to give
Mhm.
you, provide you an education and all of those human things.
But this method that you're describing sounds closer to the tradition from what you're
Although
the way you're
Coleridge
describing it.
didn't leave out what we would think of as the sciences, but
Right.
he placed them within, a greater context of knowledge and their relative relationships to each other.
But I also think that's what the fathers of classical education did. I mean, would you guys agree? Would you agree, Robert?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's dealing with a whole lot more information now because he's incorporating modern science into it. But yes, I mean, he sees things with a telos to it, a goal. It is not just separated information, and that's where the science of relations comes in that Mason taps into as well.
Okay, so that now what you're saying makes complete sense as to why she has such a unified approach basically to the humanities, which is why her curriculum and her program is very much classical because she's literally showing us how to integrate everything. through her pedagogy and her program. Okay, this is good. Now you're actually making me want to read it. In between having another grandchild in a few months, my number 9 is on the way. So, um, okay. So, um, when you talk about on method and the way you're explaining this, how do you think this might have influenced her 20 principles?
Well, I think that the whole principle of education as the science of relations is born in this book. And since I consider that to be, right next to children are born persons, the two central principles, and everything else is connected to it. I mean, all of her principles grow out of those two basic principles. And so, you know, it's basically, inextricable. You can't um like some of the specific things that that she writes about. But Charlotte Mason called her approach to education and the principles that she articulated laws of nature.
Mm-hmm.
Laws of nature. And she talks about, she didn't actually think that she had elicited the final word about what the laws of education were, but that idea of talking about things as laws with a capital L, or in a sense she even says natural laws are divine laws, is also like foundational to the in this book, because Coleridge uses that same word, um, law. I mean, this is on page 4. This is stuff is just right at the beginning. Um, he says he's talking about the relationships of things, and he says we call the relation of law, using that word in its highest and original sense, namely that of laying down a rule to which the subjects of the law must necessarily conform. So, this is a natural law. You don't have any choice about, like the law of gravity. You just have to conform to it. And that's what Charlotte Mason was hoping to understand, or to articulate, were the laws of education. And even that idea is here in Treatise on Method.
Mm-hmm.
And
Well,
maybe something a little bit about the word method would be helpful as well, because I think when most of us hear, I'm going to give you a method, we think I'm going to give you 3 or 5 steps. And if you'll implement those steps, you will get some kind of guaranteed result. It's like a shortcut to something. And that's not at all what Coleridge is meaning by a method. Um, so he's really talking about arranging things in a thematic way that includes the goal, the end, and then the progress to get to that goal. So if we look at Mason's 20 principles, it is a kind of an example of what Coleridge is talking about by a method, right? We're starting with children are persons. We're ending with all knowledge unified and coming from the Spirit. And then kind of a plan, a logical step on how to get the student through that, to that knowledge or that outcome.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Right. And it's one of the places where I think Charlotte Mason references this book without actually saying the name of Coleridge or the book, right in volume 1 at the beginning, because she's talking about method and how it means progress toward a desired end. And that's like straight up practically quoting what Coleridge is saying here.
That's funny, Karen. I was actually just going to say in volume 1, she talks about method and system. So you went right where my brain was going too. Yeah. And she cautions about what it is. And yeah, that's really good. That's really good. Um, so, and to the caution of that too, she cautions about the dangers of a method and a system. And that's the part you're talking about, right, Karen, in volume 1?
Right. It might be I think it's all part of that same
It's kind of in
discussion.
the beginning, I think. What would be the cautions to just looking at her method and her 20 principles without reading her whole work?
Well, I mean, she calls it a synopsis herself. She's trying to distill the essence of the laws, but you can't fully comprehend them just from, you know, reading that synopsis.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
They have to be, explained at greater length,
Mhm,
and the connections between them made more clear.
mhm.
Yeah, or maybe it's like the table of contents for that methodical encyclopedia. You can't read that table of contents and understand the contents. It gives you the overall goal and the outline and some major principles, but you got to do the work to get the content out of it.
That's a good point. In fact, one of the things that we say that all of us who have read Mason is you could be reading a chapter of one of her chapters, and along the way you're thinking, oh, this is good. And then you get to the end of the chapter and she just says, but all of this is wrong. It's like, so if you only read part of a chapter, you could be thinking she's this in this one category of philosophers. And until you actually read it to the end, you don't realize she's actually criticizing that particular method, which is one of the dangers in only partially reading Mason, because you really have to read the whole book to get to the gist of it. And it's also very dangerous to just read other people's blogs and interpretations of Mason. And this is, I mean, this is again, we go back to the original source, we read the original source for ourselves. And now you guys are making me feel like I have to read Coleridge. But I do trust both of you as experts, especially Karen, since you've read it 3 times, and I'm sure you've read it multiple times too, Robert. Um, so can you expand a little more, Robert, in maybe how Coleridge influenced education in general, besides just influencing Charlotte Mason? Do you think, because you mentioned that he influenced bringing back Shakespeare, do you think he's had a greater, broader influence on education at large?
Well, I would say probably indirectly. I don't know that a lot of educators, if you've got an education degree, you're very unlikely to have read
Mhm.
Coleridge. But most of us are familiar with the Chronicles of Narnia, um, or the Princess and the Goblin, and those are directly influences from Coleridge's understanding of the imagination, his promotion and love of fairy tales. So in that way, he's been more influential than we might consider. But
Especially
his
on
philosophical works are still worthy of exploration, exploring, as Mason shows us.
hmm So it sounds like he's especially had a big influence on our classical education movement, especially with the focus on wonder and imagination that we're having right now in the movement. That's
There
really
is a
good.
whole section in this book about Shakespeare and how Shakespeare is an example of a methodical artist and writer. I can't, it's a little bit beyond me to articulate it, but, he has a lot to say about Shakespeare, and some pretty harsh criticism for critics of Shakespeare.
hmm hmm
Yeah, because I
Well,
think Coleridge's idea of great art is something that can take all of these particular things and bring them into a unified whole, which is the piece of art. Um, and so again, that would be another example of method. Can you unify all of the distinct and individual parts of something?
hmm And Karen, can you expand on Mason's connection to Coleridge with what is an idea? Because that's a big part of her philosophy.
It really is. And this is a good time to point out that one of the central premises of this particular book is that Coleridge is looking back at 2 philosophers, what he calls one ancient and one modern. So the ancient philosopher is Plato, and what he would call a modern philosopher. We don't tend to think of that, but in the philosophical sense of the term modern, the other is Francis Bacon. And he's looking, in particular, a work of Bacon's called the Novum Organum, which I don't even know if it's translated. You might have to read it in Latin if you want to read it at all. But so he's looking at Plato's concept of how the mind learns, how knowledge is acquired, and he's looking at what Bacon had to say. And he says, I was just reading this one yesterday in preparation for this discussion today. He says 19/20ths of the people who talk about Bacon at all, which is, he says they're going to bring up his idea of induction. And so if anybody knows anything about Francis Bacon at all, even today, that's what they're going to talk about, is his concept of induction, the scientific method, as being the foundation of that. And that isn't at all what interested Coleridge in this book. It was his approach to knowledge. What is it about the way that the mind learns? And so he looked at Plato and he looked at Coleridge, or he looked at Bacon, and Bacon considered himself to be like antithetical to Plato. He placed himself like in a whole different framework. And Coleridge looked at the both of them and said, "No, you're both taking the same methodical approach to knowledge, the same way that Plato says, and that's where the idea comes in, is because you're beginning with a central idea that from that point, once you've got an idea, everything begins to come together and circles around that idea, so that you make connections and find the relationships. And so that's what an idea is." And that's where that the quote that we talked about comes in, where Charlotte Mason is talking about an idea, and she links together those three philosophers. And she says it a couple times in two different volumes. She says, from Plato to Bacon, from Bacon to Coleridge. And if you've read her volumes and you've run into that particular expression, you know how, if you stop a moment to think about it, it makes no sense whatsoever that you would put those three names together unless you've read this book, which I don't know if she thought her readers had. I have no idea if this was widely read, but it's because Coleridge is talking about Plato and Bacon, and he looks at these two people who fundamentally, are dealing, because Plato is fundamentally dealing with things that can only be known by the mind, and Bacon is primarily dealing with empirical knowledge, things that you can experience with your senses. And Coleridge says, but in spite of that, they have this same idea relational approach to how those things are apprehended and understood.
Mm-hmm. And this is in volume 2. It looks like page 34 and 35. And she goes on to actually quote Coleridge, says the sources from method, which she rarely tells us. She tells us a lot of things and doesn't actually quote it and tell us where it's from. But this one, she says, in his method, Coleridge gives us the following illustration, and she proceeds to quote him from his book. So that's kind of a gem right there. And ideas are really important to classical education. That's the whole centrality of what we're doing when we're giving our students a liberal education, is that we're putting them in touch with the great ideas in the world and in the universe, so that they can make connections. Again, yeah, that's really huge. There was something else I wanted to ask. Robert, do you want to expand on that a little bit at all?
Well, another thing I noticed, that Coleridge talks about ideas in a way that's very like Mason. He talks about a capital or a captain idea. So when Mason talks about inculcating habits, she says it needs to have this kind of informing idea, and he uses very similar language on method.
Interesting. Oh, that's fascinating.
Right. Well, Charlotte Mason quotes that captain idea concept in volume 3, I think, and she talks about captain ideas. She says that every subject, thought has its captain idea. It's the center, but it's also the starting point. Which is where the idea of method and progression comes in.
Another thing, Adrian, that I noticed that's similar is this notion of Mason's that all education is ultimately self-education. And Coleridge, there's two places where he talks about method. One is this essay for the beginning of his encyclopedia, but he also published, you could subscribe to his newsletter, and he would send you out a weekly essay, and he did a series of 6 or 7 essays on method where he has similar material, but some of it's a little different. And he gives this analogy of a tree, and I think it would be helpful because it's really communicating that principle. He says you could look at a tree, and he says if you're a carpenter or if you're a guitar maker and you want to make use of the tree, you would cut it down and you would take the trunk and the branches and you would make things from it. But he says if you would like to transplant that tree into another field, you would have to remove it by the roots, and it would be incredibly important to keep the roots with it. And he says education has a parallel to this. If you just want education for its use, right, you can just be given information and you can repeat that back on a test. But if you want to be truly educated, you've got to have that with the roots, with the ideas behind it, with the pathway of getting it, like that tree. So the student must be the one who gets that nourishment and produces the learning again. And I love that analogy with using or transplanting a tree, and all education being self-education. The student actually has to go through the steps and work through that means of learning. And that's clear in Coleridge, and it's clear in Mason's works.
If I could just add to that, that illustration is an excellent way of kind of showing the difference between living and not living education, which we think of Charlotte Mason as being a living education. And that's why it has to have the living roots through which, those vital ideas of nourishment can reach the student, so that continuous growth, it will bear fruit rather than cutting it all down and just having some wood that's dead.
Mm-hmm. Can we reflect for a minute on what self-education means? Because we have some misunderstandings, thinking some people think when Charlotte Mason says self-education, that just means we're putting them out to nature for free for all. We're unschooling. We're just letting them discover willy-nilly whatever they find without teacher direction. What does Coleridge and what does Mason mean by self-education?
I can't speak for Coleridge on this one, but for me, for Charlotte Mason, the obvious analogy, because she's always talking about how the mind feeds on ideas. It's the same idea that you can't digest food, eat, swallow, chew, and digest food for anybody else but yourself. And that's the same thing. That's what she means by self-education. Somebody else, a teacher can prepare the meals and lay them out for you and serve them up, in due and fit portions, but you have to do the chewing and swallowing and digesting for yourself. And that's what she means by self-education.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a quote from Coleridge that's going to show something very similar. He talks about students that he knows that have been beschoolmastered, betutored, belectured, and anything but educated. And then this is what he says: and all from inattention to the method dictated by nature herself, to the simple truth that as the forms in all organized existence, so must all true and living knowledge proceed from within, that it may be trained, supported, fed, excited, but it can never be infused or impressed. Right. So you can't pour it in, you can't mold the student, but they can be trained, they can be supported, they can be fed, they could be excited by gaining that knowledge. And that's pretty close to what Mason is saying too.
Right. And is this, yeah, she says the same thing. She talks about the mind feeding on ideas. And she points out that, anything you do externally, you know, she might even mention mud baths at one point. Like all those things externally cannot nourish and sustain life. That life comes only from what you take in.
Mm-hmm. So this reflects this philosophy that a child is not an empty vessel to fill, but that a child is coming to us fully and completely a person. So that goes back to principle one, that as we were created in God's image and we are fully human, then we are not empty vessels that need filling, which is a huge difference in philosophy of how we're going to teach a child. If we think they're an empty vessel that needs our filling, then that is a very different philosophy than what Charlotte Mason is giving us and what Coleridge is giving us, right? So I want to camp on this for a few minutes, because then another misunderstanding with Mason is that we aren't preparing the meals. We're not giving them a lesson. I've heard it said that Charlotte Mason probably doesn't even have lesson plans. How would you respond to that, Karen?
Well, I mean, obviously she did, and her programs were laid out, with. I mean, she has a lot of principles related to the way, keeping lessons short, having lots of variety, that are almost every when she because of her analogy to the mind being a living organism that feeds and is nourished by ideas. Almost every principle that you can think of for good, healthy physical meals has a correlating concept in the way that we lay out a program for our children. And it isn't. It was never random. I mean, she's really harsh even when she talks about scrappy knowledge and a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Again, it's the idea of progression through with a method of reading. Even though you read slowly, your portions are small, you take the time to digest, you have lots of variety, um, but there's a structure to it. It's not just random. It's been well thought out, and I mean, she thought it was a pretty serious uh, matter of choosing the books that the children would read.
Robert, do you want to expand on that too?
Yeah, and I do think sometimes people think it's just simply reading the books together, and there is more to that. A teacher who is going to do this well does have to be prepared. There's some ground to be laid a lot of times before a lesson, whether it's pointing out a few challenging words that the student might stumble over when they hear the story, and then hopefully reading it well and beautifully, and then being able to engage the child in a little discussion, and other things. But it sounds very simple, but it is an art, and it's something that you have to prepare for.
Yeah. So she does in her books show us the way to teach a lesson. And
Yeah.
she has examples of lessons in her books as well. Examples of assessments. I know those are on the Ambleside Online website. There's an entire page full of assessments. So these children were assessed. They weren't just left out to nature to run
No,
around.
no,
They were
they were.
given assignments of what to read, what to discuss.
No fill in the blank, no multiple choice. Now they did sometimes write their answer in poetry, but
And language,
Right.
foreign language, they had to narrate in Latin. They sang in French. I think they did German and Italian as well.
Yeah, in the upper forms.
So, yeah, so I just want to make sure that we clarify what we mean by self-education. Do you guys want to add to that at all?
yeah, I would just point out a couple of the programmatic things in her lessons, right? Students are systematically reading Shakespeare and Plutarch through their entire educational career, and that those two things would be an education in themselves, and certainly incredibly challenging.
And not every
Right.
classical school is having their students read Shakespeare and Plutarch starting at the age of 9.
No problem. I think that you're right. It is very easy to misunderstand the concept of self-education, and Charlotte Mason is pretty emphatic about, right? There is no education, she says, except self-education. And but when she says that, she's not setting it forth as a philosophy. She's actually stating it as one of these laws in a way. It's because it's just the same way there's no kind of digestion except self-digestion. That's just, that's it. This is the way the mind works, the way that true education happens.
Mhm, mhm.
But it just because of the language that she uses, it is sometimes misunderstood.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and the analogy of digestion is not a new one either. I mean, even if she got it from Coleridge, she could have gotten it from any of the fathers of classical education. That
Oh, yeah.
analogy is in all the tradition, all the way back. I remember, I don't know which essays now, but I know I've read it in multiple.
Pretty sure
I,
Milton uses it, but I don't think it was original with him either.
I think Hugh of St. Victor even has it in his Didascalion book. I mean,
Yeah,
it's in a lot of them. It's probably even in Quintilian. It's in like so many.
right.
Because it's a good analogy.
Yeah, it's hardly original with her. It's
Like
not.
I'm not going to pre-digest all the ideas for my children. I want them to, like you said, Robert, I'm going to give them a few things like, let's look at this map because, Greece is going to be in the story. Let's look at where Greece is compared to where we are. And then a couple characters, Alexander the Great or, um, I'm thinking immediately of the story that I love, Alexander and Diogenes, and then just introducing a few names, and then let's read the story about them. And it's a beautiful way of teaching. It's super easy. Once as a teacher, you get used to the idea of being able to at least skim for some words that might be a challenge or places. Present it quickly, and but you put it in a lesson plan. I remember when I was homeschooling, I would skim ahead, find some words. Let's look them up before we read this. We would read it. And so I had a lesson plan. And then, some conversational questions that we could dive into, or the conversational questions, honestly, are easy to do after you've narrated or during the narration. I mean, Karen, don't you, when you're talking about narration, do you encourage conversation if a student's struggling?
Well, you mean like after a reading, if a student's struggling to
Yeah, or even
narrate?
during a narration, asking them, tell me more, or what do you remember?
Oh,
Or,
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, narration, especially with younger children, is a learning process for a good while sometimes. And so, yeah, to if you get a short, really short or incomplete or unsatisfactory narration, yeah, I do encourage, trying to get a little more, but not pushing. I don't mean that, but just tell me one thing. Can you tell me one thing? Or let me tell you something. And then do you have anything else? Just, for the sake of encouragement. I think that it's a good idea to allow space for deeper discussions after narrations, but I don't think that you should expect that to happen after every single lesson and every single thing. Um, if you make the space, and ask a question or two, uh, the, in those lessons and those times when the student is very, very engaged and ready to have the discussion, you've created space for that. But to expect that kind of deep discussion after every lesson is probably unrealistic.
mm-hmm. What are your thoughts, Robert?
Yeah, and I think the overarching goal is slow growth over time, and I don't think you can underestimate the power of the method when it's done slowly and over time.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I do want to at least say to our listeners, homeschooling, getting narrations from one child in a homeschool is definitely harder than having a classroom narrate. I
I
mean, we
agree.
have experience with that. So, like, it is when Charlotte Mason talks about the children love to narrate, my experience was that kids in a classroom love it even more than homeschoolers. I have two of my four children absolutely hated narrating for quite a long time because it's really hard to do it by yourself. And narration is so beautiful in a classroom. The kids, they hear something and then they like, oh, I want to add to that. I want to add something. They get really excited. So narration is very beautiful, and she's right when she talks about the children loving to narrate. Because my experience, especially in schools, is that they do love it. But I know that sometimes moms will get frustrated, and I was one of those moms. But I just had to believe in the process and keep doing it and doing it. And over time, long periods of time for some of my kids, it took a long time to get good narrations. And in fact, one of my daughters in particular really struggled with giving me oral narrations until she was able to do written narrations, and she did great with written narrations. She could write and write and write. So some students actually do better with written, and that's just kind of a thing. But narration is a definite part of self-education, but it's also a definite method of learning that's important.
I don't think that one comes from Coleridge, though. I don't find
Oh,
that
no,
specific
it
method of
doesn't.
narration in this particular book, at least.
No, it doesn't. Well,
But there are some other things.
she
There are
pulled
some other
from a lot.
places that I have encountered that a similar way of learning.
Oh, what do you mean?
Oh, there's Quintilian mentions narration, Erasmus mentions narration. There was this group of educators related loosely to Blaise Pascal in France called the Port Royal. I think the Port Royal educators, teachers. Anyway, they use narration. They practice narration as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I know Charlotte Mason knew about them because I read about them in one of the books that she read.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And it would be completely natural in a more oral based culture as well. So John Chrysostom, when he talks about teaching Bible stories, that he says the parents will tell the child Bible stories and then later ask the child to tell back the story. And so this is just kind of a natural human thing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Do you guys have anything else you'd like to tell our listeners about connections you've seen between Coleridge and Mason, or any quotes you want to share or expand on? I know that there's a lot we could talk about.
I think that this book affected even some of the practical things that Charlotte Mason did do. So, for example, toward the end of this book, when Coleridge is talking about how he's going to arrange his encyclopedia, it's his idea that biography is the best way to read about history, and it made sense to him to arrange them chronologically. And we know that is essentially how Charlotte Mason arranged her historical studies. So even though she doesn't give Coleridge credit, it's entirely possible that she gleaned that idea, as well as some other practical ways for how she did arrange some of her teaching from Coleridge.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any other thoughts, Robert?
No, I think we've hit some of the big themes in Mason. Education as a life and the centrality of ideas. The science of relations, and he even says it's not only between the things and the ideas. It is the relation between things and ideas, but it's also between the person who's doing the reading or learning. There's a relation that's developed there, and then the whole idea of a method, I think, are all things that have influenced Mason.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I think that kind of wraps it up. I think we've covered a pretty good amount of Coleridge with this conversation. Do either of you want to share any kind of quotes that we didn't cover before we end the show?
I don't think I have any really important quotes. There's just so many connections. That's why I did the blog post, which I'm assuming you'll include the link to that in the show notes for this discussion. If you want to read some of the more specific links that I found between Charlotte Mason and this book of Coleridge's.
Okay. All right. Thank you guys so much. This was a really interesting conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening. You can get involved in a few ways. There's a Facebook page where we actively discuss the ideas around classical education. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/classical education. And if you want to help offset our production costs, you can support the podcast financially by going to www.classicaleducationpodcast.com/support. As the great artist and educator John Ruskin once said, "Well, my friends, the final result of the education I want you to give your children will be in a few words this: they will know what it is to see the sky, they will know what it is to breathe it, and they will know best of all what it is to behave under it as in the presence of a Father who is in heaven."